The deed was already on the table. The ink was dry. The interpreter smiled like a man who had already been paid. And Elara heard every word while pouring whiskey. When she leaned close to the cattle baron's ear, what she whispered shattered the fraud and exposed a secret buried for years. Elara Voss straightened her apron for the third time before pushing through the kitchen door of the Silver Ridge Saloon. It was the kind of establishment where a single private room cost more than she earned in a full month, and where girls like her were trained for one thing only, to be invisible. "Table in the back needs tending," said the floor manager, Hatch, passing her without a glance. "Land deal. 2 Texans, 1 German. High stakes. The whiskey's already breathing. You pour, you clear, and you don't exist." "Understood." Elara nodded. Over the past month, she had learned that the best way to survive in this job was to become part of the scenery. A shadow with a tray. A hand that appeared and disappeared without anyone registering the face attached to it. But as she arranged the glasses on the pewter tray, her hands slowed. Not from nerves, from something deeper, something older. The kind of tremor that comes when the body recognizes a territory before the mind does. Like a scout who smells smoke before seeing the fire. German. Someone at that table was speaking German. Elara breathed slowly, forced her shoulders down, and pushed through the saloon door, carrying the tray as though it held nothing but glass and whiskey, and not the weight of a life she had been trying to forget. The private table sat in the most secluded corner of the Silver Ridge, separated from the main floor by a timber partition and the kind of low candlelight that turned every face into something dramatic. Elara approached without a sound, her worn boots soft against the floorboards. 3 men occupied the table. The first, silver-streaked hair cut with deliberate precision, dark vest, no tie, a pocket watch that caught the candlelight in a way that announced its price without needing a tag. Cord Halstead. Elara did not know his name yet, but she recognized the type immediately. Men who occupied space not just with their bodies, but with their presence. Men who made decisions worth more than towns. Beside him, leaning slightly as though maintaining strategic proximity, sat a younger man. Dark coat, hair slicked with oil, a smile too easy to be genuine. There was something in his eyes Elara recognized at once. Calculation wearing the costume of charm. Wade Tillman held a leather satchel with documents that seemed far too important for that careless grin. The third man was the foreigner. Rigid posture, broad hands resting flat on the white tablecloth, pale eyes, an expression serious enough to anchor a ship. When he spoke, Elara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Ich bin froh. Das war Jonas endlich persönlich treffen, Mr. Halstead. Dies Partnerschaft konnte für beide Seiten sehr bedeutend sein." Elara nearly dropped the tray, not from shock, but because every word in German entered her mind like water finding a dry riverbed. Fast, forceful, with the devastating naturalness of something that had always belonged there. "I am glad we are finally meeting in person, Mr. Halstead. This partnership could be very significant for both sides." The translation formed automatically. Complete, precise, instantaneous, as though someone had switched on a machine she had sworn she would never turn on again. She began pouring whiskey with mechanical movements, concentrating on the angle of the bottle, the level in each glass. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind quiet. Her mind refused to obey. Wade Tillman leaned toward Cord and translated. "He says he's very honored by the meeting and has high hopes for what comes next." Elara paused. The translation was not wrong. It was simplified, stripped bare, but passable. Perhaps she was reading too much into it. Perhaps she should just pour the drinks and walk back to the bar. She clung to that possibility as she returned to the service counter and began polishing glasses that were already clean. But her ears stayed locked on that back table like 2 weather vanes pointed into the same wind. The German, whose name she would later learn was Ernst Brauer, responded with a longer, more deliberate statement. Elara translated it silently in her mind. "I must be honest. The deed contains some troubling terms, especially the division of the land parcels. We had discussed an equal split, half to each party. But the deed states 60% to your holding and 40 to mine." It was a serious complaint, the kind that could derail an entire negotiation if not handled with honesty. Wade listened, nodded slowly, and turned to Cord. Mr. Brower says he's satisfied with the terms of the deed. Just asked for a few small wording adjustments. Elara set down the glass she was polishing. It struck the counter with a sharp ring. Her hands were trembling, and it was no longer the old tremor of recognition. It was something purer and colder. Outrage. Wade was not simplifying. Wade was lying. He had taken a legitimate complaint and dressed it as approval. Made a serious man sound agreeable when he was questioning the very honesty of the contract. She walked back to the kitchen and pushed the door open with her shoulder. "Table in the back needs more bread," she told Hatch, though no one had asked for bread. She needed an excuse to return. She needed to hear more before making any decision that could cost her the job, because that was what was truly at stake. Not heroism, not justice. The wages that covered her mother Dora's treatment at the physician's house in Caldwell. The roof over the head of a woman who had given everything so her daughter could study, and who now depended on that same daughter for every medication, every night without pain. Elara prepared the bread basket with hands that were now steady, the steadiness that comes after fear, when the decision has not yet been made, but the body already knows which way it will fall. She returned to the table. Ernst Brower was leafing through the printed deed, tapping specific paragraphs with his index finger and raising detailed questions in German. Elara placed the basket on the table in silence and listened. This clause here, Section 7, Paragraph 3, it states that all disputes regarding the land will be settled under Texas jurisdiction. We had agreed that a neutral federal mediator would have authority over any disagreements. Jurisdiction in a land deal was the difference between mutual protection and a legal trap. If Ernst signed accepting Texas jurisdiction without realizing it contradicted the original agreement, he would be placing all legal power in Cord Halstead's hands on Cord Halstead's ground. Wade translated without hesitation. He praised the drafting of the dispute clause, said it's well structured. Cord smiled with satisfaction. "Good. My attorney worked hard on that." Ernst continued, his tone firmer now. "Ich bin damit nicht einverstanden. Können wir das ändern? I do not agree with this. Can we change it?" Wade did not even blink. "He's asking if the whiskey is from this region. Seems he's quite taken with it, Mr. Halstead." Elara's blood ran cold. Ernst had expressed formal disagreement about jurisdiction. Wade had turned it into a comment about whiskey. It was so brazen that for a moment Elara wondered if her German had eroded after so many years away from it. But no, she knew what she had heard, with the same certainty she knew how to breathe. Cord laughed. "Tell him it's from a distillery up in Wichita. Good stock." Wade translated the response about whiskey with flawless precision, because when the information was harmless, he was impeccably accurate. Elara watched Ernst Brower frown slightly. The German had expected an answer about the deed and received a comment about liquor. But since he understood no English, he had no way of knowing that his serious question had been replaced by a triviality. The negotiation reached its critical moment. Ernst held the pen above the deed, asking one final question. "Just to confirm, the land split is equal, 50-50 as we discussed, correct?" Wade smiled. He said he's ready to sign. No objections. Ernst positioned the pen on the paper. Cord was leaning back in his chair, satisfied. Wade held the leather satchel like a man holding a trophy. Elara leaned in to pour whiskey into Cord Halstead's glass. She was so close she could feel the warmth rising from his coat, could see the texture of the deed centimeters from her fingers. And then, in the quietest voice she could manage without becoming inaudible, she spoke into his ear. "Sir, your interpreter is lying." Cord went still. "A quick one, if you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't reach 100 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Please subscribe to my channel to keep supporting me. Now let's continue." The German just asked if the split is 50-50 as they agreed. He didn't say he wants to sign. He's asking a question. And the jurisdiction clause, Mr. Brower disagrees. They had agreed on a federal mediator. Your interpreter told you he praised the drafting. Cord Halstead froze. The glass stopped halfway to his lips. His eyes moved slowly to Elara, And what she saw in that gaze was something she knew well, the disorientation of someone who realizes the ground beneath them is not solid. "Are you certain?" he murmured so quietly she nearly had to read his lips. "Absolutely." The silence between them lasted 2 breaths. Then, with a composure that impressed even Elara, Cord set his glass on the table, looked at Ernst Brower directly, and said something no one at that table expected. His German was rough, heavily accented, the pronunciation of a man who had learned a handful of words from a field dictionary and nothing more. But it was German. Cord Halstead was apologizing directly, bypassing Wade Tillman entirely. Ernst's eyes widened. Wade stopped smiling. Cord stood from the table, buttoned his vest, and walked to Elara. "Come with me." In the narrow corridor between the saloon floor and the kitchen, a space that smelled of wood smoke and soapy water, Cord faced her. "Who are you?" Elara held his gaze. She saw her own reflection in his gray eyes. A woman in a plain apron, hair pinned back, no adornment, looking as out of place as a law book on a gambling table. "I'm the girl who poured your whiskey." "Girls who pour whiskey don't speak German. This one does." Cord studied her for a long moment. Elara did not look away. "Every translation he's given in the past 40 minutes has been altered," she said before he could ask more. He softened objections, omitted questions about the land split, and reversed Mr. Brower's position on jurisdiction. "Mr. Brower thinks he's negotiating. Your interpreter is making sure he signs without knowing what he's agreeing to." Cord ran a hand over his jaw. "Why are you telling me this? You don't know me. You could have stayed quiet and gone home with your wages." The question cut through something inside her. He was right. She had every reason to stay silent. The physician's bill, the rent, her mother's next week of treatment. "Because I know what happens when someone who's supposed to translate the truth decides to translate lies instead," Elara answered. Her voice did not tremble, but there was something in it that made Cord understand this woman was not speaking from theory. She was speaking from scar tissue. Cord nodded once. "Stay here. Don't leave this saloon." And he walked back to the table with steps that were no longer those of a man closing a land deal. They were those of someone who had discovered he was sitting with an enemy disguised as an ally. Elara leaned against the wall and felt her legs give way beneath her. She slid down to the cold floorboards, her apron crinkling against the wood. After years of hiding behind trays and aprons, after burying so deeply the woman she truly was that she had almost believed that woman had ceased to exist, Elara Voss had opened her mouth. And now, sitting on the floor of a corridor that smelled of smoke and soap, with her heart pounding and her hands trembling on her knees, she did not know whether she had just saved herself or destroyed herself. But she knew, with a certainty she had not felt in years, that she had done the right thing. And that nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same after tonight. Cord Halstead walked back to the private table with the expression of a man who had learned to disguise earthquakes behind a steady face. But inside, every step carried the weight of a freshly born certainty that changed everything. The man sitting to his right, the man he had trusted to be his voice in another language, was robbing him in plain sight. He sat down, adjusted his vest, and looked at Wade Tillman with the same cordiality as before. He needed more than a saloon girl's word to accuse someone. He needed proof. "Wade," he said casually, picking up his glass. "Before we move forward, ask Mr. Brower to repeat his position on the land split. I want to make sure I understood correctly." "Of course, Mr. Halstead." Wade turned to Ernst and spoke in German. In the corridor, Elara was on her feet again. She had lifted herself from the cold floor, smoothed her apron, and moved to the gap in the door that opened onto the saloon floor. From there, every syllable from the private table reached her clearly. What Wade had said in German was not what Cord asked. Cord had asked Ernst to repeat his position on the land split. Wade had asked whether Ernst was satisfied with the deed. Completely different questions. One sought transparency, the other induced agreement. Ernst responded with the direct honesty Elara had already come to recognize as his signature. "As I already stated, the land split in the deed deviates from our original agreement. Equal shares was the foundation. The deed states 60 to your side and 40 to mine. Elara held her breath. Ernst was saying it again, clearly, deliberately, and now Wade would have to translate in front of a man who already knew the truth. Wade turned to Cord with the ease of someone who had done this without consequence many times before. Mr. Brower confirms he's comfortable with the financial terms. Says the division is adequate. Cord did not move a single muscle in his face. But Elara saw, even from a distance, something change in his eyes. A hardness that had not been there before. The kind of coldness that men like him did not develop from cruelty, but from necessity. When they discovered that someone they trusted was using that trust as a weapon. Interesting, said Cord, and the word came out so neutral it could mean anything. And the jurisdiction clause. What does he say about that? Wade turned to Ernst without hesitation, and Elara caught every word he spoke in German. Mr. Brower, are you ready to sign the deed now? He had not asked about jurisdiction. He had asked if Ernst was ready to sign. He was steering the entire conversation toward a signature, and Elara was beginning to understand that the person who would benefit from that signature might not be Cord Halstead at all. Ernst frowned. Sign? No, not yet. I am still waiting for a response about the clauses I raised, especially the arbitration clause. Wade listened, and for the first time, Elara noticed something shift in his face. A fraction of a second where the smile faltered. A blink longer than normal. The micro-expression of someone who senses the script is slipping out of his hands. He recovered quickly. He's eager to close. Asked if we can finalize the signing tonight. Cord placed his whiskey glass on the table with excessive care, the kind of care that comes when the hands want to do something very different from what they're doing. Wade, he said, and his voice had changed. Lower, slower. I'm going to do something I've never done in a land negotiation. Wade tilted his head. Of course, sir. Whatever you need. I'm going to ask the girl who served us tonight to come to this table. The silence that followed was so thick Elara felt its weight from the other side of the door. Wade blinked twice in rapid succession. The serving girl? He repeated, and for the first time his voice lost its professional smoothness. Yes, said Cord. The one who poured the whiskey. Wade let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they don't understand the joke but know they need to react. With all respect, Mr. Halstead, we're in the middle of a land negotiation. I don't think a saloon girl. I didn't ask what you think, Cord interrupted. The 6 words fell on the table like stones. Wade's laugh died. Ernst watched the scene without understanding the English, but reading the tension between the two men with the quiet clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms. Cord made a discreet gesture toward the bar. Fetch the woman who was serving this table. Elara. Elara heard her name from the other side of the door, and her stomach dropped clean through the floor. He had remembered her name. She didn't recall giving it. Perhaps it was the tag on her apron. Perhaps he was the kind of man who read people as naturally as he read maps. Whatever the reason. She was being summoned to a table where a man she had just exposed was waiting, with eyes that could hold either gratitude or ruin. She pushed through the saloon door, crossed the floorboards with steps that looked steady but carried the weight of an irreversible choice, and stopped beside the private table. Sir, she said, and her voice came out even. Cord looked at her, then at Ernst, then at Wade. Then he said something she did not expect. Elara, I'm going to ask you to do something unusual. I'm going to say a sentence in English, and I want you to translate it directly into German for Mr. Brower. Can you do that? The entire saloon seemed to shrink. Elara felt the weight of the apron on her shoulders as though it were made of iron. She smelled whiskey and candle wax and the cedar of the timber partition. And beneath all of it, she felt something she had not felt in years. A spark. Small, fragile, and unmistakable. I can, she answered. Wade shifted in his chair. Mr. Halstead, this is completely unnecessary. I am your official interpreter, and I can assure you. The sentence is this, Cord continued, ignoring Wade as though he had ceased to exist. He looked directly at Elara and spoke slowly, with absolute clarity. Mr. Brower, I apologize. I believe there have been serious problems with the translation tonight. I would like to ask you directly, what is your true position on the land split and the jurisdiction clause of this deed? Elara looked at Ernst Brauer. The German watched her with genuine attention, not the condescending curiosity of a man watching a saloon girl attempt his language, but the respectful focus of someone who sensed something important was happening at this table. Elara breathed deeply and spoke. The pronunciation was flawless, the grammar perfect, the cadence that of someone who had not merely learned German, but had lived inside the language long enough to know its textures, its rhythms, its weight. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Elara counted them. In the first, Ernst Brauer's eyes went wide. In the second, Wade Tillman went pale. In the third, Cord Halstead closed his eyes briefly, like someone receiving confirmation of something expected that still hurt. In the fourth, Ernst Brauer began to speak, and did not stop. "Endlich," he said, and the relief in his voice was so raw that Elara felt her own eyes sting. She translated aloud, looking at Cord. "He says, finally. Finally someone understands him. That he has been saying all evening the land split in the deed is 60-40, not 50-50 as agreed. That the jurisdiction clause was changed without his knowledge. That he raised these concerns several times, but the responses he received made no sense. That he thought perhaps it was a misunderstanding between cultures." Cord listened to every word without moving. When Elara finished, he turned to Wade Tillman. The smile had vanished from Wade's face. In its place was something Elara recognized immediately, the expression of a cornered animal calculating its escape routes. "Wade," said Cord, and his voice was so controlled it was more frightening than any shout. "Do you have anything to say?" Wade opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Mr. Halstead, there's been a misunderstanding. Legal German is extremely complex and certain nuances. Did Mr. Brauer say at any point tonight that he was satisfied with the land split? The interpretation of certain German expressions can vary depending on." "Yes or no, Wade?" The silence that followed was the answer. Cord stood from the chair, not with haste, but with the calculated deliberation of someone who makes decisions worth fortunes every day, and knows that the way you rise from a table says as much as the words you speak. "Elara," he said, and now he looked at her with an expression entirely different from any he had worn that evening. "Could you tell Mr. Brauer that I sincerely apologize for everything that occurred tonight, that this meeting is suspended, that I will ride to him personally with a new certified interpreter to redo the entire negotiation from the beginning, and that his trust is more valuable to me than any deed." Elara translated every word without altering a single comma. Ernst Brauer listened, and when she finished, the German did something no one at that table expected. He extended his hand to Elara. "Danke," he said simply. "Thank you." Elara took his hand and felt the firmness of that grip, the respect contained in that single gesture, and had to bite the inside of her cheek to stop herself from breaking down right there in the candlelight. Cord picked up the deed that lay on the table, the one Ernst had nearly signed, and folded it in half with a sharp, deliberate movement. "Wade," he said without looking at him, "leave this saloon. My attorney will be in touch." Wade stood. His hands were trembling. He opened his mouth one final time as though to say something, but found in Cord Halstead's eyes something that made him change his mind. He took his hat from the chair back and walked to the saloon door without looking back. The sound of his boots on the floorboards was his only farewell. When the door swung shut behind Wade, Cord turned to Elara. Ernst watched the scene in silence, already understanding more than any translation could explain. "You saved this negotiation," said Cord, "and you likely saved me from a land dispute that would cost more than I can calculate right now." Elara did not know what to say. She stood beside a table holding two of the most powerful men in that room, wearing a saloon apron and worn boots, having just dismantled a fraud in flawless German. "I did what was right," she answered. Cord studied her for a moment. "Who are you, Elara? And this time I want the real answer." Elara looked at her own hands, the same hands that poured whiskey and cleared glasses, that had just simultaneously interpreted a land negotiation with the fluency of someone who had done it professionally. "It's a long story," she murmured. "I've got all night," Cord replied. And something in the way he said it, without pressure, without demand, just the patient openness of someone who recognized that certain stories need room to be told, made Elara feel something she had not felt in a very long time. The desire to be seen, not as a saloon girl, not as a shadow, not as the woman who hid behind aprons to survive, but as Elara Voss, whole with everything that meant. And for the first time in years, the fear of showing who she truly was seemed smaller than the fear of spending one more day pretending that person did not exist. The saloon had emptied. Most tables were already cleared. The oil lamps had been turned down to half. The barkeep moved on autopilot, collecting glasses and wiping the counter with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind had already gone home. But at the private table, time had stopped. Ernst Brouwer had said his goodbyes, a firm handshake to Cord, and a second, longer, more meaningful one to Elara. He said that he trusted Cord's word, that Elara's presence that evening had prevented something that could have poisoned the relationship between them for years. He left with the upright posture of a man who had recovered the certainty that he was dealing with honest people. Now only two remained. Cord Halstead, jacket open, the top button of his shirt undone, and Elara Voss, still in her apron, hands crossed in her lap like someone holding something invisible. "Sit down," said Cord, gesturing to the chair Ernst had occupied. Elara hesitated. Saloon girls did not sit at patrons' tables. It was one of those unwritten rules Hatch repeated like scripture in the early days. But Hatch had gone home, and the rules of this night had been rewritten long ago. She sat. The chair was more comfortable than anything in her boarding room. The cushions soft against the aching back of someone who had spent 8 hours on her feet carrying trays. "How many languages?" said Cord suddenly, as though resuming a conversation that existed only in his head. Elara looked at him. "How do you know there are more?" "I don't. I'm asking. But the way you translated tonight, that wasn't someone who learned from a phrase book. That was someone who lives inside the language." Elara was quiet for a moment. Then she let out a slow breath, like someone opening a door that had been locked so long they no longer knew what was on the other side. "6, she said. "English, German, Spanish, French, Comanche, and enough Apache to hold an honest conversation." Cord did not react with the theatrical astonishment she might have expected. Instead, he leaned forward with something closer to respect than surprise. "Where does a person learn 6 languages out here?" "In life," Elara answered. And when she realized that was too bare, she added, "My father was a federal treaty negotiator. I grew up moving between territories every 2 or 3 years. Before I was grown, I had already lived in 6 different posts. A diplomatic man. He had a rule: at home we spoke English outside the language of the territory. At dinner he chose a different tongue every night. And the Comanche? Fort Sorrow. My father was stationed at the federal outpost near the reservation. We stayed for 3 years. Comanche is not a language you learn from a book. It's one you absorb through the trade, the ceremony, the rhythm of voices around a fire at dusk." Cord watched her with an attention Elara had not received from anyone in a long time. Not the attention of someone evaluating, the attention of someone listening. "With that background," he said, "you should be working in federal offices, treaty halls, land registries, not pouring whiskey in a saloon." The sentence carried no judgment, only the genuine bewilderment of someone who could not fit the pieces together. Elara looked at her hands. Short nails, skin roughened from hot water and lye soap, hands that had once countersigned documents in 4 languages and now carried trays. "I worked as an interpreter and certified translator," she said, and her voice dropped lower. "After my father passed, I came back to the territories and built a practice. I translated land treaties, attended federal negotiations, did simultaneous interpretation at territorial hearings." What happened? The question she had spent years avoiding. The one her remaining friends had learned not to ask. "I had a partner," she said. "Silas. We worked together for years. He handled the administrative and business side. I handled the languages and the contracts. It seemed perfect, complementary. I trusted him completely." She paused. Cord waited. So completely that I signed documents he presented without reading every clause, because I believed he was protecting both our interests. And that was exactly what he used against me. Elara's voice did not tremble, but there was a tension in it that cost more than any visible emotion. Silas was defrauding clients using my name. He falsified contract translations to benefit one party over the other, exactly what Wade did tonight. When the scandal broke, all the consequence fell on me. My name was on the documents, my signature, my credentials. Silas disappeared with the money, never found. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of tension. It was the silence that exists when someone has just shown a wound, and the other person is deciding how to hold it without causing more pain. "And your mother?" asked Cord. Elara looked up. "How do you know about her? You mentioned her in the corridor. When I said you could have stayed quiet, I saw in your eyes that someone depended on you." Elara swallowed the knot rising in her throat. "My mother, Dora. She fell ill not long after everything came apart. Serious sickness. Expensive care. I had no income, no reputation, no prospects. Nobody in the territory would hire Elara Voss, the interpreter from the fraud case. But every saloon needed a girl to pour drinks." She passed a hand quickly across her eyes, a gesture that tried to seem casual, but fooled no one. "So the woman who speaks 6 languages, who grew up in treaty halls, who interpreted federal land agreements, put on an apron and learned to be invisible, so she could pay for her mother's care at the physician's house in Caldwell." "Yes," said Elara. "And it worked. Nobody looks at a saloon girl. Nobody asks where she came from. Nobody wants to know what she knows. And for a while, that was exactly what I needed. Not to be seen." Cord leaned back in his chair and ran a hand along his jaw. Elara recognized the gesture from earlier in the evening, the same one he made when processing information that mattered. "Until tonight," he said. "Until tonight," Elara confirmed. "Why tonight? What changed?" Elara looked at the private table, the half-empty glasses, the bread basket she herself had brought as an excuse, the spot where the folded deed had been. "Because I saw it happening again," she answered. "The same thing, an interpreter using someone's trust to bend the truth. And I was right there, hearing every word, understanding every syllable. And the silence weighed more than any consequence I could face." She paused. "When Wade translated Mr. Brower's complaint about the land split as though it were a compliment, something broke inside me. Recognition. I saw myself years ago, discovering that someone I trusted was doing exactly that. And I thought, if someone had warned me back then, maybe I wouldn't have lost everything." Cord looked at her with an intensity she could not immediately name. It was not pity. It was not compassion. It was something rarer. "Do you know what Wade stood to gain from this?" he asked, and his voice had taken on the texture of someone assembling a puzzle in real time. "I don't know the specifics," Elara answered, "but I know how it works. When an interpreter alters clauses in favor of one party, there's usually a side arrangement. The benefiting party pays a fee for the facilitation. It's more common than people want to believe in these territorial land deals." Cord was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the bar, and spoke quietly to the barkeep, who disappeared into the back. He returned to the table. "I'm sending word to my attorney tonight. If what you're telling me is true, and after what I witnessed, I believe it entirely, Wade didn't act alone. Someone placed him beside me specifically for this negotiation. Someone who saw this land deal as an opportunity to take from me without ever drawing a weapon." Elara recognized the tone. It was the same one she had used the night she finally understood what Silas had done. Disbelief giving way to a cold and relentless clarity. "Mr. Halstead." "Cord," he corrected. "After tonight, I think the formalities can rest." Elara nodded. "Cord, what are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest pocket and placed a card on the table, sliding it toward her. It was a land office card, the kind issued to certified agents. His name embossed in clean lettering. An address in the territorial capital. "I'm going to redo the negotiation with Ernst Brower from the beginning," he said. with full transparency. And for that, I need an interpreter I can trust absolutely. Elara looked at the card, then at Cord. You're offering me a position. I'm offering you the chance to go back to doing what you were built to do, Cord replied. Not as a favor, as a necessity. I need someone like you, and you deserve someone who sees who you actually are. Elara picked up the card. It was heavy stock, with a feel that belonged to a world from which she had been expelled. I can't, she murmured. Why? Because my name is still marked. If you bring me into your dealings and someone traces it back, the scandal attaches to you. Instead of solving your problem, I become another one. Cord leaned forward. Elara, an hour ago, I was about to sign a fraudulent deed that would have cost me land worth more than I care to count. You stopped that with nothing but your voice and your courage. If anyone has the right to tell me what carries risk, tonight that person is you. He paused. And you're right, the risk is real, which means I need someone who understands risk. He held her gaze. Clearly, you understand it better than anyone who has ever worked beside me. Elara held the card between her fingers, the embossed letters pressing into her skin like a promise she did not yet know if she could accept. Think about it, said Cord, rising from the chair. You don't need to answer tonight, but before I leave, I want you to know something. Elara raised her eyes. Tonight I watched someone who had every reason to stay silent choose to speak the truth. That is not something you see every day, and it is not something I will forget. Cord buttoned his vest, left a generous sum on the table that covered the entire evening's bill and the wages of every person on shift, and walked toward the saloon door. At the threshold, he turned one last time. Silver Ridge closes at midnight, Elara. But my land office opens at 8. The address is on the card. And he was gone. Elara sat in Ernst Brower's chair, alone at the private table, holding a card that weighed more than any tray she had ever carried. Around her, the saloon completed its closing ritual. Oil lamps being turned off one by one, the sound of chairs being stacked, the distant murmur of the kitchen being scrubbed down. She looked at the apron in her lap, then at the card in her hand. 2 worlds, 2 versions of herself. Her coat pocket buzzed with a folded note she had collected before her shift, left by the physician's assistant from Caldwell. She opened it. Dora asked if you're coming tomorrow. Said she dreamed about your father. Wants to tell you about it. Elara closed her eyes. She thought about her father, the treaty posts, the dinners where every night held a different language, the rule he repeated like a prayer. Words are bridges, Elara. Whoever knows how to build them is never truly lost. She opened her eyes, tucked the card into her apron pocket, beside the note and the stub of pencil she used to mark orders. And for the first time in a long while, when she stood from that chair, she did not feel like a saloon girl pretending that was all she was, nor like an interpreter pretending she was no longer one. She felt simply like Elara Voss, whole with everything that weighed and everything that promised. And tomorrow, for the first time in years, she would have a real decision to make. Elara arrived at the physician's house before morning visiting hours. The nurse at the front already knew her by name, and by the tired smile of someone who had slept little and risen too early. Your mother's awake, said the nurse. Quiet night. She asked for you 3 times before the rooster called. Elara thanked her and walked down the whitewashed corridor she knew by heart. Every plank, every door, every steady drip of medicine from a cloth compress. Over the past months, that corridor had become as familiar to her as the kitchen at the Silver Ridge. 2 worlds that should not coexist in one life, and yet they alternated like shifts of an existence split clean in half. Dora Voss was sitting up in bed, spectacles on the tip of her nose and an open book on her lap she clearly was not reading. When she saw Elara at the door, her face lit up with the intensity of someone for whom every visit was a gift she dared not take for granted. My girl, she said. 2 words. The weight of everything that didn't need saying. Elara sat in the chair beside the bed and took her mother's hand. The skin was thin, almost translucent, threaded with blue veins that looked like maps of an entire life. But the grip was surprising. Dora held her daughter's hand the way a person holds an anchor. The nurse said you dreamed about father. Dora smiled. I did. He was sitting at that big oak table at the federal post in Santa Marta, the one he'd spread his treaty papers across. You remember it. Dark timber, wide enough to seat 8. And he was laughing. Your father rarely laughed at his work. But in the dream he was laughing like he'd heard the best thing in the world. Elara felt her throat tighten. She knew that table. She had spent whole afternoons doing her lessons on it while her father reviewed land grants in 3 languages. And do you know what he said? Dora continued, adjusting her spectacles. He said, Dorothy, tell Elara to stop hiding the bridges. Then I woke up. Elara went still. The words landed in her chest with the precision of something that was not coincidence. You know how your father was with his expressions, said Dora, squeezing her daughter's hand. But I understood what he meant, and I think you do too. Before Elara could respond, a knock came at the door. A young man in a clean coat stepped in. Miss Voss, there's a rider outside with a message for you. Says it's from a Mr. Halstead's attorney. Elara stood and walked into the corridor. The message was brief, written in a careful hand. Miss Voss, we spent the night investigating Wade Tillman. What we found is more serious than Mr. Halstead anticipated. Tillman holds no legitimate interpreter's credentials. His German is functional for ordinary conversation but wholly insufficient for legal translation. He was recommended to Mr. Halstead's team 3 months ago by a board associate, a man named Fletcher Cord, Vice Deputy of Western Land Operations for the Halstead Group. Fletcher stands to gain directly from the 60/40 clause through a subsidiary holding. We also found, in the records of that same subsidiary, the name of an outside consultant registered in another territory. The name is Silas Renner. Asterisk. Elara read the last line 3 times. Silas, the partner who had destroyed her, connected to Fletcher, connected to Wade, connected to this deal. She stood motionless in the corridor. The drip of a compress somewhere down the hall. A horse nickering outside the window. The whole world continuing as though the ground had not just shifted beneath her feet. She walked back to her mother's room. Dora looked at her and read her face the way she had always read it, better than any document. What happened? She asked. Elara sat down, and this time she told everything. Not the softened version she used to protect her mother. The whole story. The saloon. The interpreter. The land baron. The whisper. The confrontation. The offer. The message. Dora listened without interrupting. When Elara finished, the silence in the room was deep enough to hear the candle burning. And why do you say you cannot accept? Asked Dora. Because my name is still marked, Mama. If I resurface in the territory's legal world, someone will trace the history. And instead of helping this man, I'll damage him. Dora removed her spectacles and set them on the book. It was the gesture she made when she was about to say something too important for any distraction. Elara, your father spent his entire life building bridges between people who did not speak the same language, between territories that did not trust each other, between peoples who believed they had nothing in common. And do you know what his greatest fear was? Elara shook her head. That the bridges he built would be used by the wrong people. That someone would walk across them carrying lies instead of truth. Dora paused. What Silas did to you was exactly that. He took the bridge you built and used it to carry poison. But the bridge did not stop existing, my girl. The bridge is you. Your languages, your ability to make people understand one another. Silas stained your name, but he did not destroy who you are. Last night, you proved that. Not with a certificate, not with a title, with your voice. The tears Elara had been holding since the night before finally found their way out. They fell in silence, without sobs, without drama. Just the release of something that had needed to come out for far too long. I'm afraid, Mama. I know. And your father was too. Every negotiation, every treaty session, every new territory, he was afraid of failing. But he used to say one thing I have never forgotten. Elara looked at her mother through the quiet tears. He said, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something matters more than the fear. Dora squeezed her daughter's hand with a firmness that no illness could fully take. You saved a man from signing a fraudulent deed because you knew it was right. That same man is now offering you the chance to go back to being who you are. And you want to refuse because you are afraid someone will discover you are extraordinary. Elara let out a wet laugh. When you say it like that, I say it like that because that is how it is, said Dora, with the gentle firmness that only mothers with decades of practice ever truly master. Go, my girl. Build the bridges your father taught you to build. And if someone tries to use those bridges to carry lies again, this time you will be on the right side to stop them. Elara held her mother's hand for another moment. Then she stood, pressed her lips to Dora's forehead, and walked to the door. Elara, her mother called. She turned. Your father would be proud of you, not for last night, for every day you put on that apron and did not give up. That is also courage. Elara nodded. She could not speak. She left the room and walked down the whitewashed corridor with steps different from the ones that brought her in. Not faster, not louder, just different, the steps of someone who has made a decision and is now walking toward it. In the yard outside the physician's house, she stopped beside the hitching post and took the card from her coat pocket. Cord Halstead's name, an address in the territorial capital. Embossed, clean, the kind of card that belonged to a world from which she had been expelled. She looked at it. Then at the time 8:15 in the morning. Cord had said his land office opened at 8. She tucked the card away, crossed the road, and flagged down the first coach heading toward the capital. During the ride, she watched through the window. The territory passed in fragments. Scrubland, fence posts, water troughs, lives in motion, and in the faint reflection of the glass, she saw her own face. No adornment, dark circles beneath eyes that had barely slept. Hair still pinned back with the same simple pin from the night before. But the eyes were different. There was something in them that had not been there yesterday. It was not confidence. It was too early for confidence. It was something prior, the decision to try. The coach stopped on the main road of the territorial capital. Elara stepped down and stood on the packed dirt street, looking up at the row of office buildings that lined the avenue. Men in suits and range coats moved past in every direction. The frantic choreography of those who belonged to this world. Elara smoothed her coat. She had no formal dress, no leather satchel, no credentials folder. She had a card in her pocket and 6 languages in her head. She found the building, pushed through the door. The front room was clean, with a reception desk manned by a young man in a pressed shirt. "Good morning," she said. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Cord Halstead. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but tell him Elara Voss is here. He'll know who I am." The young man made the inquiry through the back. Elara waited. The seconds stretched themselves out as though time had decided to test her resolve one final time. Then the young man looked up, and his expression had shifted. Something between surprise and deference. "Second floor, Miss Voss. Mr. Halstead is waiting." Elara walked to the stairs. As she climbed, she reached up and unpinned her hair, letting it fall to her shoulders. Not from vanity, from decision. Because the woman climbing those stairs was no longer the saloon girl of the Silver Ridge. Nor was she yet the interpreter she had once been. She was someone in between, in the exact space between who she had needed to become and who she was choosing to be again. And that space, however narrow and frightening, was the only honest place she could stand. The door at the top of the stairs opened before she reached it. Cord Halstead stood in the frame, not behind a desk, not seated in a leather chair, standing in the doorway like a man who knew someone was coming but did not know if they would actually arrive. When he saw her, he did not smile. He did something better. He nodded once, with the quiet respect of someone who recognizes courage when it walks through a door. And Elara knew, in that moment, that the bridges her father had taught her to build were not destroyed. They had simply been waiting, patient and silent, for her to find the courage to cross them again. Cord said nothing when she reached the doorway. He simply nodded and led her down the hall to his office as though her presence there were the most natural thing in the world. As though interpreters appeared in land offices every morning and required no explanation whatsoever. His office was spacious but unadorned. A broad desk with organized papers. 2 shelves of ledgers and law books that looked genuinely read. A window that overlooked the main avenue and the long plain beyond it. On the wall behind the desk, a single-frame document, a land treaty signed and witnessed with the seal of the federal government in the corner. Elara recognized the type of document. She had translated dozens like it. "Sit down," said Cord. She sat. And before he could speak, she did. "Before we talk about the position, I need you to know everything. Not the shortened version I gave you last night. Everything." "I'm listening." Elara told him about the legal proceedings Silas had left behind in her name. The clients who had filed complaints against her. The interpreter's license that was suspended during the investigation, and which, even after she was cleared, was never reinstated, because the stain of association outlasted any court decision. She told him she had tried to restart 3 times at translation offices, at federal posting houses, at land registry offices, and that every time someone uncovered the history, the doors closed before they had fully opened. Cord listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened a desk drawer and removed a folded document. "My attorney rode through the night," he said, placing it in front of her. "This is what he found." Elara opened it. The first pages confirmed what the morning message had already told her. Tillman's fraudulent credentials, his insufficient German, his connection to Fletcher Cord, the vice deputy who had recommended him, the 60/40 clause directing the difference through a subsidiary holding. But the final page held something she had not expected. Records of payments. 3 transfers from Fletcher's subsidiary to Wade Tillman in the months before the Silver Ridge meeting. The amounts were substantial, and below them a name, Silas Renner, listed as an outside consultant to the same subsidiary. In another territory. Active. "Are you all right?" asked Cord, watching her face. "Silas," Elara said quietly. "My former partner. He's connected to Fletcher. My attorney identified the connection before dawn. We don't yet know whether Fletcher knew about your history with Silas, or whether that connection is older and more deliberate. But the network is larger than I imagined." Elara set the document on the desk. Her hands were not trembling. Something had shifted since the night before, since the physician's house, since the stairs. The fear was still present. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But there was something stronger around it now. The clarity that comes from looking at the truth without turning away. "What will you do about Fletcher?" she asked. "My attorney has already filed proceedings. Fletcher was removed from his position this morning. The subsidiary accounts are being traced. Wade will face legal action for the fraudulent interpretation. With Mr. Brower's testimony and yours, the case is solid. And Silas, we're working with the federal authorities. If he's where my attorney believes, he'll be located." Elara nodded. There was no satisfaction in the news, no sense of revenge, only the strange and quiet sensation of seeing pieces that had been scattered for years finally forming a picture that made sense. "Now," said Cord, shifting his tone, "Ernst Brower sent word this morning. He wants to resume the negotiation. With one condition." Elara looked up. "He asked for you." In those exact words, he said that in the entire evening at the Silver Ridge, the only person who interpreted with honesty was the saloon girl, and that if this partnership is to go forward, the saloon girl needs to be at the table. Elara felt something move in her chest. Not pride, recognition, the kind that does not come from a certificate or a title, but from someone who saw who you were through what you did. "When?" she asked. "End of the week. Here. No saloon, no third parties, no one who doesn't need to be in the room. Ernst, myself, you, and the attorneys from both sides." "I don't have an active license," Elara reminded him. "My attorney is already working on that. Based on the investigation that cleared you, and the new evidence regarding Silas, he has submitted for emergency reinstatement with the territorial licensing body. It will not be immediate, but for a private meeting between parties, we don't require a formal license. We require trust, and that you have already earned." Elara was quiet for a moment. She looked through the office window. The territory stretched below. Scrubland, road, distant ridgeline, sky. Somewhere across that landscape was the physician's house where Dora was waiting for news. Somewhere behind her was the Silver Ridge, where Hatch had probably already assigned another girl to the private table. Somewhere in between were the lost years, the closed doors, the nights she had carried whiskey to strangers while suffocating the woman she truly was. "I accept," she said. Cord extended his hand. Elara shook it. In that handshake, firm, brief, without ceremony, there was more than a professional agreement. There was the silent acknowledgement of two people who understood the full weight of trust, because both had felt exactly what happens when it is broken. 3 weeks later, Elara sat at the meeting table in Cord Halstead's office, not in an apron, not with a tray. In a simple dress coat that Dora had insisted on purchasing with money she had kept folded in a book for emergencies. "If this is not an emergency, I do not know what is," she had said, with the stubbornness that no illness could take from her. Ernst Brower entered the room and, upon seeing Elara, did something that surprised everyone present. He walked directly to her, bypassing Cord and both sets of attorneys, and extended his hand. "Fräulein Voss," he said, with a smile that transformed his serious face entirely. "Endlich arbeiten wir richtig zusammen." Finally, we are working together properly. Elara translated automatically, then realized the gesture itself had required no translation. The meeting lasted hours. Elara interpreted every word, every clause, every comma with surgical precision. When Ernst raised an objection, she rendered it fully, without softening, without omitting, without converting discomfort into politeness. When Cord proposed an alternative, she conveyed it faithfully, including the hesitations and the conditions that lesser interpreters tend to cut because they assume they weaken the message. At one point, Ernst paused and looked at Elara with an expression she had not anticipated. "Fräulein Voss," he said quietly in German. "For the first time in this negotiation, I feel I am hearing Mr. Halstead's true voice, not an edited version. His voice." Elara translated this for Cord, who listened without moving. Then he looked at Ernst and nodded, slowly, with a respect that needed no words. No filters, no distortions, only the truth passing from one language to another, like water crossing a clean bridge. The land split was set at 50-50, as it had always been agreed. The jurisdiction clause was rewritten to include a neutral federal mediator. Every term was discussed, translated, and confirmed by both parties with the transparency that the night at the Silver Ridge should have had from the beginning. When Ernst Brower signed the deed, he did not look at Cord. He looked at Elara. "Danke," he said for the second time, but this time the word carried something different. It was not gratitude for being saved. It was gratitude for being heard, for being understood in his own language, without filters, without someone else deciding what his words meant. Cord signed next. Then he looked at Elara, quietly so only she would hear. "Every word matters," he said. "You taught me that." After the meeting, Elara rode out to Caldwell. The physician's assistant met her at the door with the expression Elara had learned to read, the expression of someone with news worth delivering. "Your mother's latest results came back better than we expected," he said. "The treatment is responding. The physician wants to speak with you, but the progression has stabilized." Elara stood in the yard afterward and let the afternoon wind move through her hair. The plains stretched in every direction, wide open, patient as everything that waits without being asked. Then she went inside to see her mother. Dora was sitting up without her spectacles, holding nothing, wearing the expression Elara knew well. The look of someone waiting to hear something she already knows. "They signed," Dora said. "Not a question. They signed. And I interpreted every word." Dora smiled. The kind of smile that needs neither perfect health nor ideal circumstance to be the most beautiful thing in a room. "Your father would be so proud," she said. "I know, Mama." "No," said Dora softly. "You don't. Not completely." She paused. "He wouldn't be proud because you interpreted a land deal. He would be proud because you interpreted yourself back. After years of hiding, you finally translated yourself into the world again. And that is the hardest translation there is." Elara sat beside her mother, took the thin hand with the blue veins in both of hers, and held on. Words are bridges, Mama. Your father's. Yes, and now mine too. Dora closed her eyes with the quiet of someone who can finally rest, knowing the person she loves most has found the way home. Elara stayed there, holding her mother's hand, listening to the slow and steady sound of breathing, and the soft silence of an evening settling over the plains. And she thought about everything that had begun in a saloon with a tray and a whisper, the lies that nearly won, the truth that had cost everything, and returned something no amount of money or land could ever buy, the certainty of who she was, because life does not always give us the stage we deserve. Sometimes it places us behind an apron, behind a tray, behind silence and years of hiding. But there comes a moment when the truth refuses to stay quiet any longer. And when that moment arrives, it does not matter whether you are pouring whiskey in a saloon or signing deeds in a land office. What matters is that when the moment comes, you have the courage to open your mouth and let the bridges do what they have always done. Connect worlds that seemed impossible to reach. If the story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded. It is never too late to go back to being who you truly are.